Dziękuję bardzo. Tytuł mojego referatu: Uratowane przez socjalizm PPS-owskie wątki w życiu Michała Borwicza. Tytuł ten, a szczególnie pierwszy jego człon, nie jest sarkastyczny. Pytanie w nim zawarte, czy Michał Borwicz, znany krakowski literat, poeta, socjolog, historyk Shoah, został uratowany przez socjalizm, jest zupełnie na serio i co więcej dotyczy spraw zasadniczych, bowiem chodzi tutaj o jego życie. Gdyby Borwicz nie był powiązany z Polską Partią Socjalistyczną, prawdopodobnie nie udałoby mu się uratować z janowskiego obozu zagłady w Lwowie w okresie II wojny światowej. Znak zapytania postawiony na końcu tego zdania dowodzi jednak, że mam tu duże wątpliwości, czy sama wola i działalność jego koleżanek i kolegów, konspiracyjnych działaczy PPS wystarczyłyby do uratowania naszego bohatera od pewnej śmierci w rzeczonym obozie, czy złożyło się na to wiele jeszcze innych sprzyjających ku temu czynników. Jest to sytuacja podwójnie skomplikowana, ponieważ sam Borwicz został członkiem PPS prawdopodobnie dopiero po wojnie. Proszę wybaczyć, ale z uwagi na temat sesji mojego referatu będę eksponował tylko niektóre wątki w biografii Borwicza, które charakteryzują jego powiązania z ruchem lewicowym. Pierwotnie nazywał się Maksymilian Boruchowicz, a urodził w roku 1911 w Krakowie i mieszkał przy ulicy Pawie 22, w wielodzietnej rodzinie zasymilowanych Żydów. Jak wspominał po latach Rafał Szarf, z uwagi na jego żywy temperament został wydalony z kilku szkół średnich. W końcu trafił do gimnazjum męskiego imienia profesora Stanisława Jaworskiego, usytuowanego na rynku głównym w Krakowie, i uczęszczał do klasy typu humanistycznego, gdzie poznał Józefa Cyrankiewicza, późniejszego premiera w czasach PRL-u. Po zdaniu matury w roku 1930 poszedł na studia polonistyczne w Uniwersytecie Jagiellońskim, gdzie stosunkowo szybko, wraz zresztą ze wspomnianym już Cyrankiewiczem, studentem prawa, zajął się współorganizowaniem działalności Akademickiego Związku Pacyfistów, który istniał od roku 1926. W tym momencie warto podkreślić fakt, że wszelkie organizacje i stowarzyszenia uniwersyteckie według zarządzeń rektora musiały się bezwzględnie stosować do zasady apolityczności i apartyjności. Jakkolwiek ich członkowie mieli oczywiście poglądy polityczne i sympatie partyjne, co wyrażali choćby poprzez dobór prelegentów lub tematów do dyskusji. Wracając do Akademickiego Związku Pacyfistów, należy powiedzieć, że jego działacze stawiali sobie za cel propagowanie wśród najszerszych warstw społecznych, w tym oczywiście młodzieży akademickiej, idei pokoju i sprawiedliwości międzynarodowej oraz informowanie o działalności Ligi Narodów. Organizowali oni głównie zebrania dyskusyjne, akademie i odczyty. Według wytycznych uniwersyteckich nie można było poruszać tematów dotyczących polskiej polityki wewnętrznej i zewnętrznej. Jednakże te początkowo masowe spotkania, na które przychodzili nie tylko studenci, ale również krakowska inteligencja, urzędnicy i robotnicy, odbywały się często w napiętej atmosferze wywoływanej przez wszechogarniającą na zewnątrz sali obrad ostrą walką polityczną między zwolennikami lewicy i centrum, a prawicą spod szyldu endecji. Walka ta toczyła się nie tylko na słowa. Prawicowe bojówki używały niestety również jajek, probówek z siarkowodorem i kastetów, starając się uniemożliwić zainteresowanym dotarcie na spotkania. W Akademickim Związku Pacyfistów pełnił Borwicz funkcję zwykłego członka, zastępcy sekretarza, wiceprezesa i przewodniczącego komisji rewizyjnej. Wielokrotnie występował również publicznie na zebraniach związku. Na jednym z nich, które odbyło się w sali nr 66 w Collegium Novum 6 grudnia 1935 roku, wygłosił referat poświęcony powieści Le Feu, Journal d'une Escouade, niedawno wówczas zmarłego w Moskwie francuskiego pisarza Henri'ego Barbysa. Książka ta, za którą zresztą otrzymał nagrodę Goncourtów, jest głęboko antymilitarystyczna i została oparta na jego doświadczeniach z okresu I wojny światowej. W Polsce okazała się w roku 1909 pod tytułem Ogień, pamiętnik oddziałów w okopach. Z kolei na spotkaniu pod tytułem Z zadrutów kolczastych sprawa Osieckiego, które odbyło się 4 grudnia 1936 roku, Borwicz był jednym z prelegentów omawiających postać Karla von Osieckiego, niemieckiego dziennikarza, pisarza i pacyfisty, laureata Pokojowej Nagrody Nobla z roku 1935, który spędził ostatnie 8 lat życia w więzieniach i obozach koncentracyjnych, gdzie też zmarł, za ujawnienie tajemnicy wojskowej o zbrojeniach Reichswehry mimo zakazów traktatu wersalskiego. Liczba członków Akademickiego Związku Pacyfistów stale jednak malała z uwagi na ciężką sytuację finansową i wrogie nastawienie studentów o poglądach nacjonalistycznych, którzy często uciekali się do przemocy fizycznej, tak wobec członków tej organizacji, jak i mienia, w tym ich tablicy informacyjnej, która była stale niszczona. W okresie studiów Borwicz zaangażował się także w działalność nowo utworzonej pod koniec 1933 roku Akademickiej Ligi Pracującej Palestyny Ahdut. Stowarzyszenie to stawiało sobie za cel, cytuję, krzewienie języka i kultury hebrajskiej oraz naukowe uzasadnienie konieczności odrodzenia narodowego, społecznego i kulturowego narodu żydowskiego w Palestynie na zasadach pracy. Koniec cytatu. Wskazuje to na głęboką ewolucję poglądów Borwicza, który właśnie na studiach zapewne w ferworze nieustającej walki politycznej z innymi studentami o poglądach nacjonalistycznych, wcześniej obojętny religijnie i czujący się po prostu Polakiem, rozkochanym w rodzimej literaturze, odkrył nagle bardzo silnie swoją żydowską tożsamość. Co więcej, będąc ograniczany w wyrażeniu swoich poglądów politycznych w murach uniwersyteckich, rozwinął swoją działalność organizacyjną i odczytową także poza nie. I tak już w maju 1934 roku, cytuję, z powodu niemożności porozumienia w sprawie wyboru władz stowarzyszenia i nieodbycia walnego zebrania, koniec cytatu, organizacja ta została przez Senat UJ rozwiązana i mimo dalszych zabiegów w celu jej reaktywacji w tym i następnym roku zamiary te spaliły na panewce. Zresztą prawdopodobnie jeszcze w marcu tego roku Borwicz został członkiem żydowskiej socjalistycznej partii robotniczej po Alei Sion, zwanej popularnie po Alei Sion Prawica. Wszak już od 31 dnia tego miesiąca występował na jej zebraniu z referatem pod tytułem Momenty społeczne w literaturze europejskiej. Partia ta była blisko związana z sionistyczną partią pracy Hitahdut, z którą współpracowała przede wszystkim w ramach Ligi Pomocy Pracującym w Palestynie i należała do Światowej Organizacji Syjonistycznej. Opowiadała się za kulturową i narodową autonomią w świeckiej gminie żydowskiej. Stała w opozycji do rządów sanacji. Aktywność Borwicza w ramach działalności tej partii została odnotowana przede wszystkim poprzez jego wystąpienia na licznych odczytach i wiecach w Krakowie. Ich tematyka oscylowała zasadniczo wokół 3 głównych zagadnień: walki z faszyzmem, literatury zaangażowanej i sytuacji politycznej w Palestynie. W niniejszym referacie z wiadomych względów skupię się jedynie na kwestiach natury politycznej. W lutym 1935 roku Borwicz przemawiał w duchu antyfaszystowskim obok 2 innych prelegentów na wiecu zorganizowanym przez Komitet Miejscowy po Alei Sion dla uczczenia pierwszej rocznicy tzw. Powstania Lutowego w Wiedniu. Spotkanie to odbyło się w lokalu przy ulicy Miodowej 39 w Krakowie w obecności około 130 osób. Warto może przypomnieć, że wspomniane powstanie wybuchło z powodu nagonki austriackiego rządu na opozycję socjaldemokratyczną, w której wyniku usunięto jej zwolenników z organów administracji państwowej. Po wybuchu protestacyjnego strajku robotników i ich krwawych walkach z policją w Wiedniu i Lincu tamtejszy rząd rozwiązał partię socjaldemokratyczną. O tym, że niebezpieczne zmiany w polityce rządów wielu państw mają charakter globalny i odnoszą się również do Polski, przekonywał zapewne Borwicz wraz z Adamem Ciołkoszem i Kalmanem Hauserem podczas odczytu pod tytułem Europa na przełomie. Miało to miejsce w kwietniu w roku 1936. Spotkanie to zgromadziło 500 osób. W tym samym roku dla około 100 słuchaczy zebranych w Żydowskim Domu Akademickim Borwicz wygłosił odczyt pod tytułem Heretycy marksizmu. W trakcie swojej działalności politycznej, co zrozumiałe, Borwicz stykał się nader często z działaczami PPS-u. I to nie tylko podczas pochodów pierwszomajowych, tak jak to miało miejsce w roku 1936, kiedy przedstawiciele socjalistycznej partii Hitahdut, po Alei Sion Prawica i Bundu dołączyli na placu Jabłonowskich w Krakowie do pochodu PPS, gdzie też Borwicz między innymi przemawiał, ale również na ich partyjnych spotkaniach, zapewne w charakterze przedstawiciela zaprzyjaźnionej organizacji. Składał później w rodzimej partii sprawozdania z tego typu wizyt, jak to miało miejsce w lutym 1937 roku, kiedy w obecności około 120 osób wygłosił odczyt pod tytułem Kongres PPS w Radomiu. Wrażenia i problemy. Podczas niego docenił sprzeciw członków PPS-u wobec antypalestyńskiej rezolucji bundu i jednolitofrontowych propozycji komunistów. Zaangażowanie Borwicza w działalność POLIN prawicy zostało należycie docenione i już w czerwcu 1937 roku z ramienia tej partii został umieszczony na liście bloku pracującej Palestyny jako zastępca delegatów z Małopolski Zachodniej i Śląska na 20. Kongres Syjonistyczny. 2 lata później z tego samego bloku został już wpisany w charakterze samego delegata na 21. Kongres Syjonistyczny w Genewie, na który zresztą pojechał przed samym wybuchem II wojny światowej. Borwicz udzielał się też w pracach Związku Akademików Syjonistów Socjalistów Achdut, być może swoistego pogrobowca wspomnianej Akademickiej Ligi Pracującej Palestyny Achdut. Jak dotąd nie udało mi się ustalić, od kiedy działała ta organizacja i jakie miała konkretne cele. W roku 1937 organizowała głównie zebrania protestacyjne przeciwko wprowadzeniu getta ławkowego na wyższych uczelniach w Polsce. Na jednym z takich spotkań wystąpił Borwicz z referatem, być może właśnie w tym temacie, m.in. na wieczorze inaugurującym zapewne nowy rok akademicki 1937-1938, który odbył się w październiku tego roku w lokalu tej organizacji mieszczącym się w tak zwanej Strzesze Borochowa przy ulicy Starowiśnej 89. Z tego, co powiedziałem, widać więc, że jakkolwiek Borwicz nie należał przed wojną do PPS, a przynajmniej nie ma tam na to źródłowych dowodów, to jednak był bardzo dobrze znany w tym środowisku i uznawany dzięki wyrazistym lewicowym poglądom, rozpoznawalności, zaangażowaniu w działalność partyjną żydowskich organizacji blisko współpracujących z tym ugrupowaniem oraz zapewne kontaktom osobistym z przedstawicielami tej partii, talentowi oratorskiemu i wreszcie licznym publikacjom w gazetach, czasopismach. Przed II wojną światową ukazała się też jego jedyna powieść Miłość i rasa. Okres II wojny światowej w życiu Borwicza jest już bardzo dobrze znany. Dzięki jego wspomnieniom zawartym w rozlicznych jego artykułach i książkach, takich jak Literatura w obozie, Uniwersytet Zbirów, Organizowanie wściekłości czy Spod szubienicy w teren oraz opracowaniom tematu. Dlatego dzieje te przedstawię jedynie w wielkim skrócie. Na samym początku wojny, jak zresztą wielu innych z Krakowa, Borwicz wyjechał do Lwowa, który znalazł się pod sowiecką okupacją. Tam mógł się przekonać, na czym polega socjalizm czy komunizm w wydaniu radzieckim. To skłoniło go do ucieczki na Litwę, która jednak nie doszła do skutku. Borwicz wrócił do Lwowa, jak wielu innych kolegów i koleżanek po piórze, wstąpił prawdopodobnie do Związku Sowieckich Pisarzy Ukrainy. Po wybuchu wojny niemiecko-radzieckiej dostał się pod okupację niemiecką i jak inni Żydzi został najpierw zamknięty w getcie, a następnie doprowadzony do janowskiego obozu zagłady, gdzie wykazał się wielkim hartem ducha i odwagą. W obozie uniknął wielokrotnie śmierci i dał się poznać jako ten, który współorganizował tam wieczory literackie, pisał wiersze i przeżył powieszenie, ponieważ urwał się z szubienicy i został ułaskawiony przez SS-mana. Dzięki swoistej obozowej sławie Borwicza jego przyjaciele, w tym Adam Rysiewicz, Stanisław Wincenty Dobrowolski i Maria Hochbeck-Mariańska, krakowscy działacze konspiracyjnej organizacji PPS-WLN i jednocześnie Rady Pomocy Żydom Żegota, dowiedzieli się, że nadal żyje w obozie i zorganizowali mu podrobione papiery i możliwość ucieczki z Lwowa do rodzinnego miasta. Po udanej ucieczce z obozu we wrześniu 1943 roku Borwicz dotarł do Krakowa, gdzie jednak nie mógł długo zagrażać miejsca z powodu obaw przed dekonspiracją. Jeszcze w tym samym miejscu wraz z Piotrem Oraczewskim, Stanisławem Kowalczykiem, Janem Długoszem, Anną Kuciel został wysłany przez Okręgowy Komitet Robotniczy PPS w Miechowskie i Proszowickie w celu zorganizowania oddziałów partyzanckich na tym terenie. Borwicz objął w efekcie komendę oddziałów wojskowych i bojowych PPS w powiecie miechowskim. Trójkowe oddziały bojowe były oddzielone od cywilnych komórek politycznych. Pod komendą Borwicza stanowiły część składową Armii Krajowej na mocy tzw. połączenia od góry, to znaczy ustalał on warunki współpracy bezpośrednio z inspektorem AK, Bolesławem Nieczują-Ostrowskim, ale zachowywał wewnętrzną autonomię. Będąc w partyzance, Borwicz odwiedził wiele wsi i miasteczek. Organizował ćwiczenia wojskowe w terenie i gawędy w stodołach czy wiejskich szkołach. Pisał również, w tym wiersze, do konspiracyjnego organu PPS Wolność, który był odbijany co tydzień w Krakowie. Niektóre jego numery były przeznaczone wyłącznie dla bojowców. Słowo wolność stało się salutem i hasłem oddziałów bojowych PPS. Co ważne, Borwicz występował w partyzance pod przykrywką i nie ujawniał swojego pochodzenia żydowskiego. Do zabawnej sytuacji doszło w związku z tym już po wojnie, kiedy Borwicz przebywał od paru lat na migracji w Paryżu. Jego koledzy na jednym ze wspólnych spotkań usłyszeli od znajomego, że Borwicz jest w rzeczywistości Żydem. Kiedy nie udało mu się tego w sposób łagodny wyperswadować, doszło do rękoczynów. W liście do Borwicza jeden z jego kolegów dodaje z rozbawieniem o tej sytuacji, że ten facet dostał na co sobie słusznie zasłużył. Jak wiadomo, Borwicz wojnę przeżył i ponownie zamieszkał w Krakowie, gdzie w 1946 roku objął stanowisko kierownika Wojewódzkiej Żydowskiej Komisji Historycznej. W styczniu tego roku zapisał się do nowej zwanej lubelską PPS i otrzymał legitymację partyjną z numerem 40250, podpisaną przez sekretarza generalnego Wojewódzkiego Komitetu PPS w Krakowie Lucjana Motykę. Borwicz uregulował należność 20 zł za tzw. wpisowe i legitymację partyjną oraz wpłacił 40 zł za pierwsze 4 miesiące składki partyjnej. Więcej składek już nie zapłacił. Motywacje jego nie są do końca znane, ale bardzo szybko rozczarował się linią polityczną, albo bardzo szybko rozczarował się linią polityczną nowej partii, która jak się okazało nie miała wiele wspólnego z przedwojenną odmianą, albo ze zrozumieniem przeczytał obowiązki jej członka zapisane w 10 punktach legitymacji, którą otrzymał, albo miał to związek z krytyką jego poczynań przez prezydium partii na pierwszym po wojnie zjeździe bojowców PPS w Warszawie. Krajowy zjazd uczestników walki zbrojnej o niepodległość i demokrację odbył się w połowie czerwca 1946 roku w jednej z największych zachowanych po wojnie w Warszawie sal odczytowych, a mianowicie w gmachu Domu Katolickiego Roma imienia Piusa XI i zebrał około 4000 uczestników. Obrady otworzył premier Edward Osóbka-Morawski i marszałek Michał Rola-Rzymierski. W imieniu organizacji wojskowej i organizacji bojowej PPS WRN Okręgu Krakowskiego przemawiał również Borwicz, który, jak twierdzi, wywołał wielki entuzjazm zebranych bojowców, wymieniając po kolei ich nazwiska i akcje, które przeprowadzili przeciwko Niemcom samodzielnie i wspólnie z oddziałami AK. Głosy z sali skandowały, że są przeciwnikami dyktatury, każdej dyktatury. Przewodniczący zebrania Kazimierz Rusinek usiłował łagodzić rewolucyjny wydźwięk odczytu. Jednak najwidoczniej wystąpienie Borwicza wywołało konsternację w loży rządowej i polemiczne wystąpienie Osóbki-Morawskiego. Po wystąpieniu premiera odczytano listę osób, którym rząd przyznał krzyże zasługi, medale zwycięstwa i wolności oraz inne odznaczenia. Wśród nich znalazło się również nazwisko Borwicza. Ten jednak odmówił jego przyjęcia. Podobnie uczynili także inni dwaj jego koledzy z Krakowa. Podczas omawianego zjazdu Borwicz pokłócił się ze swoim szkolnym kolegą Józefem Cyrankiewiczem, który w listopadzie 1946 roku wszedł w skład tymczasowego rządu jedności narodowej jako minister bezteki, a po sfałszowanych wyborach do Sejmu Ustawodawczego od 6 lutego 1947 roku został premierem nowego rządu. Drogi przyjaciół się rozeszły. Jakkolwiek Borwicz, nachodzony przez dziennikarzy i agentów Urzędu Bezpieczeństwa, odmawiał wszelkich wywiadów na temat nowego premiera. Będąc zagrożony wplątaniem go w przyszłe walki partyjne wokół osoby Cyrankiewicza i obawiając się aresztowania z uwagi na swoją nieprawomyślność wobec nowej, komunistycznej linii PPS i partyzancko-akowskiej przeszłości, postanowił czym prędzej wyjechać z kraju. Jako dyrektor Żydowskiej Wojewódzkiej Komisji Historycznej w Krakowie planował już wcześniej wyjazd z misją naukową do krajów skandynawskich. W tym momencie zintensyfikował swoje przygotowania do niego i pod koniec marca 1947 roku z Gdańska wypłynął statkiem do Szwecji. Stamtąd w lipcu tego roku dotarł do Paryża. Mieszkając w stolicy Francji, Borwicz do końca życia utrzymywał bliskie kontakty ze swoimi przyjaciółmi z grona działaczy PPS i kombatantów PPS, WRN i AK poprzez uczestnictwo w organizacjach kombatanckich i zjazdach oraz osobistą korespondencję. Oczywiście z uwagi jednak na ograniczony czas mojego wystąpienia, temat ten muszę odłożyć na później. Podsumowując więc moje rozważania dotyczące PPS-owskich wątków w życiu Borwicza, muszę stwierdzić, że gdyby nie jego zaangażowanie w działalność polityczną w okresie międzywojennym i zawiązane w tym czasie przyjaźnie w środowisku krakowskich rozsocjalistów oraz słowem dobrego mówcy literata, miałby bardzo marne szanse przeżycia w obozie janowskim, czy nawet po ucieczce z niego. Z kolei po wojnie, jeśli by się opowiedział po stronie komunistów, którzy uznali, że nie wszyscy z 30-milionowego kraju mogą wyjechać i dlatego należy jakoś ułożyć sobie życie pod okupacją radziecką, mógł podobnie jak jego kolega Cyrankiewicz uzyskać wysokie stanowiska w hierarchii partyjnej lub nawet w rządzie. Odmawiając współpracy z nowym reżimem, mógł się spodziewać, że ten jego socjalizm przyczyni się raczej do jego szybkiego upadku, więzienia, a może nawet śmierci, jak to miało miejsce w przypadku rotmistrza Witolda Pileckiego. Co prawda raczej nie socjalisty, ale również niezłomnego towarzysza niedoli Cyrankiewicza, tym razem z obozu w Auschwitz. Jakkolwiek po śmierci Borwicza długoletni premier PRL zamieścił jego nekrolog w prasie codziennej. A więc jak widać, socjalizm mógł ratować przed śmiercią, jak i do niej doprowadzić, w zależności od zmiennej sytuacji geopolitycznej, w której znajdował się także nasz bohater. Borwicz, niezłomny w swoich socjalistycznych poglądach, wydaje się, że dobrze wyczuwał, skąd wieje wiatr historii i właściwie dobierał przyjaciół, a dzięki innym sprzyjającym okolicznościom skutecznie wyrwał się z miażdżących nazistowsko-komunistycznych trybów. Serdecznie dziękuję za uwagę.
Thank you very much for this presentation on Michał Borwicz and his journey from Jewish social democracy and socialism to Polish socialism and back to Jewish history. We will now proceed with Michał Trębacz, who will present on Shmuel Zygielbojm, Bundist in Polish London. The person, his name is probably known to most of you here. Let me just quickly introduce Michał Trębacz, who is the head of the research department here at POLIN Museum, which means he's also my boss. And he is also a historian and scholar who earned his PhD in history from Łódź University with a thesis on the Bundist activist Israel Lichtenstein, and yeah, this is part of his new research project, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan, for the kind invitation and introduction, sorry. And as one of the organizers of the conference, I should not complain on the time that I have for the presentation, but the time is very limited, and this is why I cannot tell everything that I want to tell. And the part that I have to omit is a short biography of Zygielbojm, so I will just point out the few facts that are important for the paper. So Shmuel Zygielbojm was a Bundist. He was, during the Second World War, the representative of Bund in the National Council, that is the form of Polish parliament in exile. And in 1943, he committed suicide as an act of protest against the indifference of the world in face of the face of the Holocaust. Now we start. In his farewell letter addressed to the Prime Minister and the President of the Polish Republic, Shmuel Zygielbojm wrote, and I quote, "My life belongs to the Jewish people in Poland, so I'm offering it to them. I wish that this handful of survivors from the several millions Polish Jews stay alive until the liberation together with the Polish masses. I do hope they will be able to breathe in the country and in the world ruled by the socialist freedom and justice, to compensate for their order and unbearable suffering. I do believe that such Poland and the world is in the making. End of quotation. This fragment of the Zygielbojm's letter is often ignored, and I think that it's not only ignored because it's on the second part of the on the second page of the letter, but also that it does not fit to the profile of Zygielbojm that most of the Polish historians and journalists would like to present right now, but I can refer to this later on. Including such a statement in one of the last messages left by the Jewish politician shed a new light on the question of his ideological identification. One would think that in light of mass extermination of the almost entire Jewish community in Poland, the question of what the post-war were would be like lost its gravity. However, this was clearly not the case. Ideological identification and affections towards socialism were strong enough to find their way into the suicide note. My paper aims to determine whether Zygielbojm's idea of socialism alerted with time, and if so, how. However, instead of referring to his entire biography, I'm only going to focus on the last year of his life, that is between spring of 1942 and 1943. Thus, I shall be able to seek answer to the question on the evolution of his ideological stance in the light of being fed new information on the mass extermination of Polish Jews. In order to achieve my goal, I will analyze Zygielbojm's public addresses in which he referred to, albeit not always directly, his own understanding of socialism and of the duties of a socialist in the context of drastically changing reality. The ultimate pre-war program of Bund from 1935, that is the ideological declaration, will serve as a point of departure for the analysis of socialist Zygielbojm's stance. Instead of describing the whole document in detail, I shall focus only merely on listing basic postulates from it. So the first one was lifting the all economic, political, and cultural, formal and actual restrictions imposed to the Jewish community. The second, introducing equal rights for the Jewish community in all areas of economic, political, and cultural life. The third would be introducing full rights to secular Jewish culture and as a guarantee of further development and national cultural autonomy for the Jewish working masses. And the fourth, the Bund is as a socialist party, a part of the Polish and international social labor movement, and therefore the only joint struggle, namely a revolution instead of a new reforms, may lead to victory of socialism. And so after the outbreak of the war, Bund presented to the Polish government in exile in Angers, presented a new version of their program, the memorial, sent to the government. And this was in spring of 1940. And it basically repeated the postulates included in the ideological declaration, albeit with one difference which is very important. It devoted much more space to the issue of anti-Semitism, which, according to the Bundists, grew to be far more serious problem. And I quote, "The venom of anti-Semitism that have been instilled over many years and still is into the hearts and minds of segments of Polish society requires a particular firm and systematic reaction on the part of the Polish government, as it took upon itself the task of representing the state and its citizens. Polish government ought to take a firm stand on this issue, a stand that would break with the policy of anti-Semitism altogether." End of quotation. The memorial emphasized the joint interests of both Jewish and Polish community, thus testifying to Jewish patriotism. Already then, that is in April of 1940, an element of revolution that was to lead to the fall of the capitalism disappeared from the Bundist agenda. And this was a very important also change, that the revolution was not anymore a fragment of the program, at least not the fragment of the program that Bundist presented during the Second World War. And Zygielbojm spoke in a similar vein when he voiced his and his party postulates during his first appearance in the National Council, that is in spring of 1942. And those two documents produced 2 years apart, and during those 2 years, much has happened. The ghettos were established, where the population pursued in large numbers. First pogroms took place, and the first extermination camp in Chełmno was in operation in occupied Poland. And Zygielbojm had no knowledge about all of that, but he witnesses a dramatic change that had occurred. He used to say that, I quote, "The new order introduced by Hitler will lead to a total destruction and extermination of the Jewish population," end of quotation. However, it did not affect other elements of the presented program of the Bund. With regard to the political system, the document, the one that he presented, similar to the Angers Memorial, a much more moderate version of the ideological declaration of 1945. The fragment dealing with the socialist revolution that was to lead to truly just and social political system had been left out. Instead, the program included a passage on the joint Polish-Jewish history and on the Jewish people deep involvement to the issue of the Polish independence. On the surface, neither of those two documents that I presented right now say much about Zygielbojm's individual stance or his biography. For these were not the documents that express his beliefs or reflections, but rather party declarations of which he was a co-writer at best. And yet, Zygielbojm decided to present them both, taking responsibility for their content and upon himself. We can definitely venture a statement that back then he was capable of complying with the party line, which was not at all obvious, judging by the elements that took place in the following months. Zygielbojm's Polish experience taught him to seek allies in his endeavors. Both ideological declaration of the Bund mentioned solidarity in the Polish-Jewish fight for independent Poland, but first and foremost about the common goals of Polish and Jewish socialists. And having arrived in London in spring of 1942, Zygielbojm found himself in an entirely new environment. There was no Bundist in London at that time, and there were even no Bund supporters there. Thus far, his only contact with the Polish politicians were with the socialists, and he succeeded in keeping those contacts and extending them significantly, which is testified by joint motions submitted at the National Council meetings. Moreover, he developed an almost friendly relationship with Adam Ciołkosz, a Polish socialist. The Polish socialists helped Zygielbojm to adapt to the life in London and acted as his guides through the meanders of the Polish politics. Undoubtedly, Zygielbojm took the declaration of joint interests of Polish and Jewish workers seriously. Therefore, cooperation with the PPS, the Polish Socialist Party, seemed to him natural and welcomed. Having arrived in London in late March 1942, Zygielbojm strove to establish contact with socialists in Great Britain, and also from other European countries. It was then, rather than politicians from the Jewish parties, who became the closest allies and associates of the Bundists. This testifies to the continuation of the Bund's pre-war politics, stressing that there are no issues that unite the entire Jewish community, as the community puts particular stress on the social class divisions. Interestingly, Zygielbojm stood by his convictions even when the first information on the Holocaust began to reach him. Initially, but also later on, PPS activist Adam Ciołkosz, as well as politicians like Kamil Huysman and William Gillis, offered their support to Zygielbojm in informing the free word on German crimes and appealed for freedom for Heinrich Ehrlich and Viktor Alter, the two leaders of Bund who were detained in the Soviet Union. Thanks to Ciołkosz's help, Zygielbojm became a member of Huysman's committee. Through this committee, Zygielbojm became a part of British and exiled socialists around Huysman and Labour Party International Secretary William Gillis. Zygielbojm became a member of the committee in 6 July 1942. against the instruction of his comrades in the U.S. in New York. The Bund, at that time, the Bund was the leadership of the Bund was in New York, and Zygielbojm was just a representative of this of the party, and he was supposed to present the party line, not his own. But on this question, he disagreed. And the Bund discouraged only relations outside a Polish framework, as it could potentially upset Polish politicians who supported what was needed to negotiate on the behalf of Poland and on its behalf in Poland and the USSR. Zygielbojm complained to the Bund General Secretary Emanuel that non-participation in international socialist circles would be damaging to links with these circles and dissemination of propaganda therein. Being a socialist in London meant also taking part in the discussions with this movement. And during the Second World War, one of such debates within the Labour Party and the European left in Britain was the one on the nature of Nazis. On one side of the argument, there was those who saw the rise of Nazism as a result of class contradictions. The actions of Nazi regime were therefore the responsibility of the Nazi leadership. Germans and Austrians on the left could picture themselves as Nazis' first victims, and some chose to do so. On the other side of the argument were those who saw Nazism as a consequence of the nature of German culture and tradition. Zygielbojm also participated in this discussion. The analysis of Nazism and Nazi anti-Semitism were beyond the sphere of Bund's interest before the war. Prior to outbreak of the war, the Bund did not acknowledge the threat posed by Third Reich racist anti-Semitism. Zygielbojm had never referred to this issue directly, which does not necessarily mean that he didn't consider it's crucial. How could one stick to Marxist definition of Nazism in the face of incoming information on mass murder committed on Polish Jews? The answer gave rise to more questions, such as, how do you understand the responsibility for committed murders? Who should be rendered responsible? How do you go about a new post-war order? In summer of 1942, a brochure titled I'm sorry. Let's do it like this. Okay. A brochure titled "Stop Them Now: German Mass Murder on Polish Jews" was published by the Polish Communal Information Liberty Publication, which was associated with the Ministry of the Polish Ministry of Information. In contained document, along with descriptions of German atrocities committed in Poland, it also contained Zygielbojm's text in which he wrote, I quote, "The Germans are trying to exterminate the whole Jewish population of Poland, 3.5 million people. This is, however, only part of a plan to exterminate the whole population of Poland," end of quotation. And further on, also a quotation, "Stop the Germans now." He insisted on using the term German instead of Nazis. On the 2nd of December 1942, during a mass rally organized by the Labour Party in Caxton Hall in London, Zygielbojm spoke about the crimes committed by Germans. He stated, and I quote again, "The German oppressors cannot forgive the Polish people that they did not yield to the Führer and that they did not find among them a Quisling," end of quotation. It seems that this change was by no means accidental. The documents quoted above always mentioned Nazis and Hitlerists. What triggered the change? I could point to at least two reasons. Firstly, Zygielbojm knew perfectly well the nature of Nazi anti-Semitism right now. The scale and brutality of crimes committed in the name of the ideology rendered it difficult to believe in the fact that the common Germans were unaware of what was going on. Zygielbojm's private correspondence and his public addresses during the sessions of the National Council demonstrate that he indeed shared this point of view. For example, in January 1943, Zygielbojm wrote to Emanuel, I quote, You are asking about the news from home. Alas, they couldn't be worse. Germans are carrying out the plan to exterminate the entire Jewry. End of quotations. And towards the end of 1942, during a session of the National Council, Zygielbojm proposed organizing an exhibition which would present, I quote again, the German operation aimed at exterminating the Jewish population in Poland. End of quotation. In London, Zygielbojm was also offered support by the activists of the Labour Party and the trade unions, the so-called Vansitariatists, who were adamant about the cultural interpretation of Nazis. Such a stance was also represented by the above-mentioned Huysman Committee, who believed that Germany as a whole shared responsibility for Hitler's crimes. Also a member of another socialist organization, Vanguard Group, that Zygielbojm presented in his in-depth analysis and reflections on the future of the Europe and the socialist movement. He referred directly to the failure to assess the power of Nazism. And I quote again, "Let us confess that we have made mistakes. We have not estimated the situation correctly. We have not foreseen the development of the events. We have judged Hitlerism only as an expression of the interests of international capitalism. This was true up to a point. But today, we know that fact that Hitler's movement exists to satisfy the lust for power and the imperialistic aspiration of the German nationalism is still more important." End of quotation. However, Zygielbojm address title Prospects of International Socialism in Europe was devoted mainly to the future of Europe. His vision remained utterly pessimistic. He claimed that the internationally ruptured labor movement was not able to effectively join the fight for socialism. Interestingly, in the same address as in the two declarations mentioned at the very beginning of my paper, revolution ceased to be the route to socialism. It was replaced by the idea of establishing a European Federation of states, which did not necessarily have to be organized straight away, but was in ways more like a process. Zygielbojm was the only representative of Bund in London for slightly over a year. He arrived in London in the most dramatic moment, when the information on mass extermination of Jews first reached the West. His ideological evolution was determined mostly by the context against which he had to operate. He had to find his way through the meanders of the Polish and international politics himself. It took him a short time to free himself from the influence of his comrades in New York and begin making strategic decisions on his own. Undoubtedly, Zygielbojm remained faithful to the idea of cooperation of the entire labor movement, from Poland and from abroad. It was precisely this cooperation that he considered a hope for the reconstruction of post-war Europe. However, his vision differed from the pre-war ideas of socialist revolution aimed at the system evolution. Asked for an answer to the question on what determined Zygielbojm's stance, I would point to the two things. First is obvious, the Shoah. The second is the political milieu within which he operated. Influenced by Polish and European socialists, it's clearly visible in Zygielbojm's attitude both to Germany and the issue of the European future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michał, for this presentation and the insights on Shmuel Zygielbojm's thinking and the development of his thinking on the Holocaust as it happened in London. We are now moving away from this distant view and zoom into the Warsaw Ghetto with the next presentation by Maria Ferenc, who is a doctoral student at the University of Warsaw and a researcher at the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and who will today present on Shmuel Breslaw, the unacknowledged intellectual leader of Hashomer Hatzair in the Warsaw Ghetto. Maria is in an advanced stage of her PhD, writing her PhD on the sources and meanings of information in the Warsaw Ghetto, and is working on an encyclopedia of the Warsaw Ghetto in her work at the Jewish Historical Institute. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you for it and for this introduction. And before I start, just let me briefly address one issue, because I couldn't escape my willingness to make the presentation, because as a historian of the Holocaust, I just so rarely have the occasion to gather iconography to illustrate what I am talking about. So this is actually what the presentation will be. And I think that Shmuel Breslaw, is certainly the youngest of the three men discussed in this panel, because he was only 22 in the time when he died. He was born in 1920 and died in 1942. But I still believe that even though his life was so short, his biography is meaningful, rich, and worth being studied, and that he somehow managed to fulfill his intellectual potential to some extent, at least. Breslaw was one of the Hashomer Hatzairs, wartime intellectual and organizational leader in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was influential also outside of his organization, and was one of the important personalities in the Jewish underground movement in the Warsaw Ghetto, and ferocious advocate of armed resistance against Germans. Hashomer Hatzair, as you probably all know, was a youth organization created in 1913 in then Austrian Galicia. Its main ideological pillar was Zionism and training of its young members for work in later Mandate Palestine. But Hashomer Hatzair had always been also a leftist movement, although it was not affiliated with any of the big political parties active on the Jewish street in the interwar period. Hashomer Hatzair was partially inspired by ideas of Borochov, who came up with his own fusion of Marxism and Zionism, as well during, as we can see in their wartime writings, by the writings of an Austrian Otto Bauer and Paul Stanisław Brzozowski, but due to time limits, I will not be able to discuss it at length here. On the eve of the World War II, the organization had some 20,000 members in Poland alone, and between 1,000 and 1,500 in Warsaw. It was the Warsaw branch where young Breslaw was still a member, and later an instructor of other young Shomrim. In my paper, I'm going to present his biography, show how wartime events accelerated and influenced Breslaw's intellectual development, and discuss how he triggered movement's political radicalization. I also want to reflect upon Breslaw's ideas that later became crucial for the underground movement, mainly and particularly his vision of resistance. Quote, "That's how it is, my brother. Movement lacks people. 19-year-old boys like me have to take up positions. It does not seem optimistic to me personally," wrote Breslaw after coming back from the summer camp in Polesie in a letter sent in August of 1939 to his brother, Chaim, nicknamed Fima, who lived in the kibbutz in Mandate Palestine. 2 weeks later, World War II broke out, which had changed and determined the future course of Breslaw's life. It had impacted his plans and worldview, but also his organizational position within Hashomer Hatzair, to which he had belonged since the age of 13. As I mentioned, Breslaw was born in 1920 in Moscow, in the upper middle-class Zionist family. He had two brothers, Józek, who emigrated to France, and Chaim, to whom he wrote this letter that I quoted before. This is Chaim, who emigrated to Mandate Palestine. Both brothers survived the war, and their descendants live in France and Israel now. He had also had a sister who perished in the Warsaw Ghetto along with his parents. Breslaw's letters to Fima, Chaim, were partially preserved and became one of the important sources for this paper. Breslaw, prior to the war, was an excellent student. He graduated from a bilingual Polish-Hebrew high school, but university studies were never his primary goal. He wanted to emigrate to Eretz Israel to follow his brother's footsteps, and the path that he chose for himself were shaped entirely by his belonging to Hashomer Hatzair. It also influenced his personal decisions because he kept postponing his emigration till the moment when movement is ready to sort of let him go, which actually never happened. Third Reich attacked Poland on September 1, 1939, and around September 6, when it became rather clear that Poland will not last, leadership of Hashomer Hatzair had decided to dissolve the organization, hide all the traces of its functioning, although individual members continued to meet. In the first weeks of German occupations, tens of thousands of young people, especially Jewish, fled to the east. Many refugees arrived in Vilnius, a large city that used to belong to Poland before the war, and then found itself in independent Lithuania. Hundreds of members of Zionist youth movements, Hashomer Hatzair, Dror, Gordonia, had chosen Vilnius as their safe haven. It seemed much safer than German-occupied Poland for obvious reasons, and as an additional plus, they were able to keep in touch with their leaders in Eretz Israel because Lithuania did not introduce restrictions on postal correspondence. It also offered a possibility of continuing immigration to Eretz Israel, which was absolute priority for Zionist youth movements. Main figures of the leadership of the Polish branch of Hashomer Hatzair arrived in Vilnius in the autumn of 1939. Breslaw probably left Warsaw with the bigger group of Shomrim in the first half of September of 1931, following the order of movement's leaders to relocate to the east. He took the banner of the organization and carried it all the way to Lithuania. They walked towards a border town of Brześć, then crossed to the Soviet Union, and only then, after several weeks of wandering, arrived in Lithuania. Breslaw must have been quite enthusiastic about USSR already back then, since he wrote that, quote, a socialist consciousness rebelled, end of quote, against leaving this country and moving on to Lithuania. He was not the only one among young Shomrim to appreciate Soviet Russia. The issue of Soviet Union vis-à-vis Zionism became the central subject of discussions of Hashomer Hatzair members in Vilnius and later in the Warsaw Ghetto as well. Quite many Shomrim managed to actually make Aliyah from Vilnius, but Breslaw was not among them. On February 3rd, he wrote to his brother Fima again from Ukmerde, a provincial town in rural Lithuania. Quote, I am certain that I will be in Eretz, whatever happens and whatever history brings, end of quote. It seems, however, that in early 1940, Breslaw had abandoned hope to leave for Mandate Palestine anytime soon and decided to subordinate to leaders' orders and go back and stay in Poland and try to rebuild a movement there and to sort of embrace wartime challenges standing before the movement. By February 1940, Tosia Altman and Mordechai Anielewicz, other important leaders of the organizations, were already back to Generalgouvernement with the intention of rebuilding Hashomer. So were the leaders of the Dror, who also moved to Vilna in the first months of the war. Breslaw left Lithuania together with Josef Kaplan shortly afterwards. On March 8, he returned to Warsaw and reported to his brother that he was, quote, well and in good mood, end of quote. He moved in with his parents to their pre-war apartment. He did not stay long in Warsaw, though. In late March or early April, shortly before Ghetto in Łódź was sealed off, Breslaw went there with a mission of encouraging local leaders of Hashomer Hatzair not to leave the town and not to abandon the members of the organization. He was regarded by the leaders as, quote, a talented and resourceful guy, end of quote, so no wonder that he was charged with an important mission of traveling around Nazi-occupied Poland, staying in touch with local activists and reviving movements functioning in smaller towns of Podlasie and eastern Mazovia regions. In the same time, other leaders of Hashomer traveled to other corners of the occupied Poland. In the summer of 1940, Breslaw certainly had spent some time in Warsaw, where he was busy preparing articles for the first issue of Płomienie, Flames, newspaper. Probably in late November 1940, Breslaw received yet another task. He was relocated to Radom. And this is his Ausweis that was issued by Judenrat in Radom. He was responsible, therefore, once again, reviving Hashomer Hatzair's activity. What is interesting is that there was certainly some tension regarding Breslaw's departure to Radom. Evidently, rumor had it already then that there was some conflict going on between Breslaw and Józef Kapłan, who was the most senior member of the leadership of Hashomer Hatzair and was very moderate in regarding politics, I would say. And rumor had it that it was this tension that contributed to Breslaw's departure, but he himself vigorously denied it in his letters sent to friends who were still in Vilnius. And just this is a glimpse of various letters that Breslaw wrote, and that allowed me to reconstruct his path. So he absolutely denied that there was any sort of disaccord between them. He described as his activities in Radom as focused on ideological education of local youth. He also made efforts to create an agricultural farm near the city, and he traveled a bit around the region. Except for organizational goals that he properly fulfilled, Breslaw used his stay in Radom to develop intellectually. He had been building up his mental capital that he used so well after coming back to Warsaw Ghetto. He was learning German and read a lot. Quote, I am completing my education regarding political economy and sociology, end of quote, he wrote. In March 1941, he left Radom following the order from Warsaw. We don't know exactly what happened then. Conflict between Kaplan and Breslaw was discussed many times, but detailed reconstruction of Breslaw's activities in the first year and a half of war proves, however, that regardless of any tensions that might have been there, he remained a loyal and obedient activist of Hashomer Hatzair. He respected the decisions and followed orders. For a year, he devoted himself to almost solely organizational work, been traveling, supervising, and aiding local branches of the movement. He abandoned his plans of emigrating to Eretz Israel and limited his journalistic activity. After returning to Warsaw, and this is Nalewki Street, where kibbutz of Hashomer Hatzair had been placed in Warsaw Ghetto, Breslaw's main task became writing for Hashomer Hatzair's underground press. They had published several underground newspapers during the war. Eight press titles were preserved, but we know of several more that did not last. Breslaw had a pre-war journalistic experience in Młody Czyn. This is the cover of the. It was a Hashomer Hatzair newspaper addressed to its members, but I would say that he did not get a chance to spread his wings back then. We have to remember that he was still a schoolboy. He was 18 at the time when this particular issue was published. But even then, he wrote quite interesting articles on international politics and. For example, he made a quite interesting analysis of the fall of Blum's government in France. But only during the war he sort of developed and became a prolific and influential publicist. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that he was actively participating in creating and publishing all of Hashomer Hatzair's newspaper to some extent. He had been gathering international news through radio monitoring that he was conducting personally, wrote daily informational bulletins, tens or maybe even hundreds of editorials. It's quite hard to assume given that some of them are not signed even with the initial. He outlined Hashomer's political position in relation to current events. It is also likely that he had produced illustrations for some of the issues, and these are the covers of some of the Hashomer Hatzair's underground newspapers. And see, they were some of them were illustrated, and it's possible that it was Breslaw who did that. And some testimonies say that he even participated in circulating the press, which means that he had done it all from A to Z. His articles had a very strong ideological and political tone. Through them, Breslaw gained his immense influence on Hashomer Hatzair's informational and ideological policy. It also needs to be stressed that in German-occupied Poland, leaders of Hashomer Hatzair were left without regular contact with Mandate Palestine. Local leadership, comprising mostly of people in their 20s, had to face wartime reality alone and come up with their own interpretation and their own outline of the movement's policy. So this new situation gave them responsibility they had never had before and the freedom to transform the movement according to their visions. And Breslaw certainly took that chance. He was among the most radically pro-Soviet of Hashomer activists, and his intellectual brilliance, persuasiveness, self-confidence combined with hard work and authentic emotional engagement gave him the chance to impose it on others. Before World War II, Polish branch of Hashomer Hatzair was hardly interested in the current Jewish life in Poland, being fixated rather on the future in Palestine. During the war, however, they underwent interesting transformation. Already during a Congress of 1940, British imperialism was heavily criticized and those present agreed to adopt a pro-Soviet orientation. The feeling prevailed that only USSR would be able to defeat Hitler once the alliance of Germany and Soviet Union would be broken, and the leaders of Hashomer Hatzair were certain that this was going to happen. British politics were heavily criticized by Zionist organizations because Mandate Palestine authorities were making it more and more difficult for Jews to immigrate. As a result, Hashomer's attitude to Britons was much more hostile than it was to Soviets. The movement held on to Zionism as its foundation, but the pro-Soviet approach became an important political trend observable in their press, even before Operation Barbarossa had started. Though the movement has consistently avoided alliances with political parties, the war brought young activists closer to POLIN Zion Left Party. That was the party that Emanuel Ringelblum, the founder of the Warsaw Ghetto Underground Archive and the founder of Unacknowledged group, belonged to. The group, Unacknowledged group, was meeting since late 1940, but Breslaw and Kaplan were asked to join it in early 1942, probably as a result of the political alliance between Hashomer Hatzair and POLIN Zion Left. Also, the collaboration between youth movements and Unacknowledged became much closer after first news about extermination of the Jews in the East reached Warsaw Ghetto. Closer cooperation with the movement gave Ringelblum and his group a chance to follow the development of resistance movement in the Warsaw Ghetto. The profits were mutual. Unacknowledged had access to information about extermination in other towns and testimonies of refugees and escapees from death camps, which were being published in the bulletin that the group started to issue in the spring of 1941. Actually, all of the Hashomer's newspapers published then had a news-oriented profile, and there is no doubt that much of the information that they had been publishing originated from the bulletins of Oynek Shabbos that Breslaw and Kaplan, as the members of the group, had access to. In the same time, circulation of the disturbing news among the Shomrim certainly magnified their impact in the ghetto. We know that Breslaw was shocked with the news about the Holocaust and that his immediate response was the call for the arms, regardless of the costs. Since February 1942, when first news of Helm no Death Camp reached Warsaw Ghetto, he insisted on owning and carrying a revolver. When he heard about first deportations from Lublin, March 1942, and it was the first big town in General Gouvernement to be whose ghetto was liquidated as a part of Aktion Reinhardt, he had organized a self-defense group which was supposed to use knives and knuckles if something similar was to happen in Warsaw. Parallelly, resistance became an idea widely debated and developed in Hashomer Hatzair's press. In the article entitled "The Wave of Distractions," which was published on April 7, 1942, in Iton Hatnua, we read, quote, "Jewish youth and our movement should be the first to guard our national honor. Put an end to the passivity," end of quote. Breslaw and other authors who wrote about this referred also to the fake news that had reached Warsaw Ghetto about the rebellion in Nowogródek, in which allegedly 200 young Jews died fighting Germans, and used it as an inspiration and argument for organizing armed resistance in Warsaw. Breslaw was also a close friend of Mordechai Anielewicz, the famous leader of the April uprising, and certainly they had influenced each other a lot. Together, in summer of 1941, they had organized and conducted previously mentioned radio monitoring station for the purposes of writing news coverage for Hashomer Hatzair's press. Their collaborator was Anielewicz's girlfriend, Mira Fuchrer. Hoping that USSR might turn out to be an opponent strong enough to face Hitler's army, many of the inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto were looking with anticipation towards newly opened Eastern Front and craved news from there. Hopes were high back then that Hitler, after the blitzkrieg in Western Europe, was eventually going to lose. Later on, for conspiracy reasons, Breslaw took this task over from Fuchrer and Anielewicz and continued to prepare news bulletins based on radio monitoring until mid-July of 1942, only by himself. On July 1942, orders were posted on ghetto walls stating that all Jews would be deported to the east. This is the order. Action was brutal, and most leaders of the Jewish organizations suspected that deportees were sent to their deaths, just as those who were deported from other towns before. And it, of course, proved to be true because they were being murdered in Treblinka death camp. On July 23rd, leaders of all major political movements gathered to discuss their possible reaction to the ongoing action. Breslaw attended this meeting together with Josef Kaplan. Together with leaders of Dror, they opted for the armed resistance against Nazis. Their appeal, however, was rejected. Isaac Schipper from General Zionists and Alexander Zische Friedman from Religious Agudas Israel argued that such decision cannot be made because there was a chance that only a small fraction of ghetto's inhabitants would be deported and the lives of the rest would be spared. Friedman said he was hoping that the miracle would happen. Schipper thought that the Jews were too weak to fight. Breslaw, to the contrary, thought that Jews had nothing to lose. He was even more radical than his comrades from Zionist youth organization, while Kaplan, Tzivia Lubetkin, and others advocated for setting some kind of ambush for the Germans. Breslaw thought that the Jews should fight face to face with the Nazis, armed with whatever they could use and try to break free to the Aryan side. Heike Klinger remembered the last letter that he had sent to Anielewicz, who, during the summer of 1942, was in Zagłębie region visiting Shomrim there. in which Breslaw wrote how much he hated Germans and stressed that Jews have to take their revenge on them. Breslaw attended with Kaplan also the second meeting of the political leaders that took place on July 28th, and he was elected to the leadership of the newly established Jewish fighting organization. Once again, he desperately advocated for armed resistance. He thought that Jews should attack Germans with knives and iron bars and that there was no time to lose. And now, this is Stefan, and now let me shortly conclude. September 3rd was relatively calmer for average ghetto inhabitants, and yet it was one of the most tragic days for the underground of the Warsaw Ghetto. Josef Kaplan, who worked in one of the German workshops, was arrested, probably for the forgery of documents. When Breslaw heard about this, he thought of organizing some kind of rescue action for a friend. Most accounts say that he was caught on the street and that Germans found either a knife or a revolver with him, and he was killed on the spot. On the next day, September 4, he was buried by his comrades in the area of the pre-war Skra Stadium, right next to the Jewish cemetery in Okopowa Street, which was by then not within ghetto borders. This is the view of the stadium, which during the war was used for agriculture by agricultural organizations in the Warsaw Ghetto. Shortly after his death, Ferenc Opoczyński, another member of Ojnek Szabes, wrote, "Shmuel, a talented fellow, a great idealist and a man of action, was shot in the street today." Emanuel Ringelblum commented quite differently. Shmuel, he couldn't bear the tragedy of the ghetto, as if Breslaw's rebellion and his willingness of revenge was somewhat hopeless. To conclude, I want to stress that in a way, Breslaw remained influential figure for the Jewish underground even after his death. When Anielewicz heard that Breslaw and Kaplan, who was murdered a week later, September 11th, were dead, he was apparently devastated and decided to come back to Warsaw right away. Israel Gutman, a prominent Israeli Holocaust historian and back then a member of Hashomer Hatzair, remembered that Anielewicz brought new energy to the desperate members of the underground movement. If it is, of course, just a speculation and hypothesis, but we may always ponder how much Anielewicz was influenced by Breslaw's ideas. Once again, in this regard, when after his return, he started to mobilize underground for the armed resistance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you thanks to all of the three participants of this panel, which presented three different reactions of Jewish leftist activists vis-à-vis the Holocaust. And I think there will be plenty of questions. I already saw Anthony raising his hand. Maybe we collect three and then make a first round. So Anthony, Emma, and David. And I'll make a list and...
Well, I obviously like to thank the three participants for these three very stimulating and interesting papers. One theme which runs through them, which I'd like the panelists to comment on, is attitudes to the Soviet Union and in particular to the Polish eastern border. If we just look at the three papers on this question, clearly Józef Lichten was the most anti-Soviet. He was a member of the Home Army. He was fighting in the Home Army. Throughout this period, the Home Army was committed to the return to the 1921 frontier of Poland, something which at Tehran the Western Allies had basically abandoned in return for a Soviet promise of a non-communist Poland. Poland would be moved to the west. And as regards Breslaw, as was quite common in the Warsaw Ghetto, he was radicalized and came out with a strongly pro-Soviet position, which obviously implied the acceptance of the Curzon line, with all the obvious implications which this had for making more difficult cooperation with the mainline Polish underground. What I'd like to hear is really what Michał has to say on this question in relation to Zygielbojm, because Zygielbojm obviously died before the Tehran conference, and so we don't really know how his views would have evolved, but his contacts were mostly with British leftists, Gillis and others, who were certainly convinced, like the Hashomer Hatzair, that the only power which could effectively win the war was the Soviet Union. And one would like to know how Zygielbojm reconciled his increasing links with the Polish government in London, and in particular with the parliament in London, where he echoes a lot of their propaganda and his view on the frontier. This frontier question, of course, is one of the most divisive ones in the historiography of the Second World War, and the whole question of whether it would have been possible to establish a Finnish solution to Poland during the Second World War had the conclusions reached or the decisions reached at the Tehran conference been adopted is one of the great might-have-beens in history, and of course we are supposed not to discuss alternative history, but it's always interesting to speculate on these points, so I wonder whether people would also, on the panel, care to speculate on this question.
First of all, thank you very much for this inspiring session. Another common issue, maybe we can say, of those three papers is the fact that those three persons were in exile. And in a way, I wanted to ask if and how this feeling or the fact that they were out of the homeland effects on the perspectives, writing, connections, and yeah, well, I guess that, you know, obviously the three of them were in exile for within different time zones or historical time frame, but still it's kind of influence, I guess. So it's just this quick question. Thank you.
Also, thanks everyone for those papers. My question is just is also a common one. If everyone could talk a little more about the afterlife of these figures, and I mean, I guess it's a memory question. And I was thinking about it particularly, Michał, after you opened with this kind of, we don't normally remember Zygielbojm like this. So, I mean, I guess this question for everyone is how and why do we remember them in the ways that they get remembered?
Okay, so we have these three questions. Does anybody wants to be the first to answer, or shall we just pass the microphone? Maybe we start with Stefan.
Ja będę konsekwentny w języku polskim, także proszę założyć słuchawki. Jeśli chodzi o Michała Borwicza czy Maksymiliana Boruchowicza, to wydaje mi się, że już częściowo odpowiedziałem panu profesorowi Polonskiemu na to pytanie dotyczące jego stosunku do Związku Radzieckiego. On był socjalistą, może też komunizował przez ten okres międzywojenny, ale jak zobaczył, jak w rzeczywistości to wygląda na Ukrainie, to chciał czym prędzej stamtąd uciec. To po pierwsze. W momencie, kiedy mu się nie udało, to no, jakoś też próbował sobie ułożyć tam życie w Lwowie. Wiemy, że był duży problem dla osób, które parały się literaturą, żeby zdobyć pieniądze. I dlatego też zapisał się dosyć szybko do Związku Literatów, jeszcze tego polskiego, który to związek przestał mieć bardzo szybko znaczenie i powstał drugi związek ukraiński, później już właściwie radziecki. I z powodu tego, znaczy do końca nie mam takiego, nie mam dowodu, że on faktycznie przystąpił do tego związku, ale jestem przekonany, że tak jak i inni pisarze znani nam, także choćby Zuzanna Ginczanka, czy wielu innych, no żeby po prostu przeżyć, żeby uzyskać środki do życia, to uczynił. Natomiast on propagował taki system, żeby po prostu ci pisarze, którzy właśnie nawet przystąpili do tego ukraińskiego, radzieckiego związku pisarzy, żeby nie wypowiadać się w jakikolwiek sposób poprzez właśnie druk. To znaczy, no, agitował, żeby nie publikować, nie pisać czy do gazet, czy nie publikować poezji czy literatury. I co więcej, otwarcie występował przeciwko właśnie, może nie tak wprost się sprzeciwia, ale no, w trakcie różnych zjazdów, ponieważ ten nowy Związek Radziecki tych literatów, który został utworzony przez władze radzieckie, zorganizował szereg różnych spotkań z pisarzami, z dziennikarzami i na tych spotkaniach Borwicz występował publicznie. No, po pierwsze pokazując, że na pewno komuniści radzieccy nie muszą uczyć polskich komunistów czy polskich socjalistów, jeśli chodzi o literaturę, jeśli chodzi o klasykę marksizmu, jeśli chodzi o klasykę właśnie prac socjalistycznych. I nawet miał się wypowiedzieć, że właśnie tam w jakiejś tam wypowiedzi aparatczyka radzieckiego była taka kwestia, że po prostu no, że oni przyjmą tutaj do swojego właśnie związku, a Borwicz miał odpowiedzieć, że to nie oni są gośćmi, to ci, którzy przybyli, ci, którzy tworzą ten nowy Związek radzieckich pisarzy, to oni przyjechali, więc to my możemy ewentualnie zaprosić ich do naszego związku, a nie odwrotnie. Na pewno ten stosunek był bardzo krytyczny. Wiadomo też, że no, pewnie nie mógł otwarcie też jakoś się dalej wypowiadać też na tematy polityczne, ponieważ no, jako ten wojujący antyfaszysta jeszcze w okresie dwudziestolecia międzywojennego obawiał się po prostu, że zostanie aresztowany. Zresztą jak były ogłoszone spisy mężczyzn w wieku poborowym właśnie na Ukrainie, w Lwowie, to oni tam właśnie z ciołkoszem unikali, znaczy stali w kolejce do tych spisów, ale unikali zapisania się, zarejestrowania, żeby właśnie uniknąć aresztowania czy wywiezienia na Syberię czy coś takiego.
Thank you very much for all the three questions, and I will answer them as they were asked. The attitude to the Soviet Union, I think it's very clear for Zygielbojm, because Bund was anti-communist party, and Zygielbojm remained an anti-communist during the war, and nothing changed that. I haven't found any information, any statement that he believed that only the Soviet Union was the one who that could win the war and that could overcome the Hitler. And the problem with the Soviet Union and the Bundists is that they were strongly attacked by the communists during the Second World War. Zygielbojm was attacked by the communists in the UK, and his actions were attacked by the communists there. And also, what's very important is that the thing that I mentioned is that the imprisonment of Ehrlich and Alter in 1940 and the second imprisonment in 1941 was a very important issue for Zygielbojm and for the Bund. So they did not accept the fact that the two leaders of their movement were arrested in the Soviet Union and that they had no information about what was happening to them. And it was an important issue also for Zygielbojm to find contacts within the labor movement in England of those who could support his actions towards letting Alter and Ehrlich free. And this was a very important thing for him. After he got to know that they both were murdered, he established an action of writing protest letters to the Soviet government, and he actually found supporters also among the labor movement, among the Labour Party in Great Britain. But it doesn't change the fact that Labour Party did not want to act against Soviet Union, and they said it very strictly. So he was trying to find individual contacts and establish individual contacts with Labour Party members and other socialists who could help him in this endeavor. And about the frontier, about the borders, I haven't found any form of his statement about this fact, what was going to be the border of Poland later on. And as I can say, and as I think that that he would stick to the line drawn by the PPS, that the Bund wouldn't act on their own in this matter. This wasn't a thing that they would think that be a thing that is important to them, and a thing that they should propose their own opinion on. So this would be my answer. Acting in exile, I think this is crucial to understand the biography of Zygielbojm, the war biography of Zygielbojm. When he's out of Warsaw in the beginning of 1940, first in France, then traveling to the United States, and then in London. In London, he feels alone as a politician because he's trying to find contacts, and he does. But these are not the contacts that he would like to find there, I think. And he feels alone as a person. He left his family back in Warsaw. I know that he is terrified with the information that he is receiving, and he regrets what he did. He regrets that he left. And so yes, this is a crucial issue for the biography. And now the afterlife, this would be too long to answer, but what I meant when I said it is that in the Polish milieu right now, in the Polish publications, articles that appear about Zygielbojm, and they appear quite a lot right now in the recent years, Zygielbojm is presented as a good Jew who said that the Western countries did nothing when the Holocaust was happening, that the Allies did nothing, and the World Jewish Congress did nothing. So they don't remember the fact that he is a hero of a right-wing press right now. They don't remember the fact that he was a socialist. They don't remember the second page of his farewell letter. They don't remember the fact that he was very harsh when he spoke about the anti-Semitism in Poland. They don't remember what he said about Zofia Kossak-Szczucka appeal from 1942. This part of the biography does not exist anymore. He started to be a hero of the right-wing politicians, right-wing journalists. Even the prime minister spoke about Zygielbojm, I think a year ago, saying some stuff that never happened. He was completely making things up. But he did, yeah.
Thank you for all the questions. I will start with an answer to Professor Poloński. Thank you for this rich and really deep question. Like, we could all probably talk for hours about it. But so regarding Soviet Union, I think that the crucial thing is here that Hashomer Hatzair, being a strongly Zionist movement and really fixated on the future in Eretz Israel, was very geopolitically conscious even before the war. And for them, only major players, only major political players were sort of important because they were the only ones who could actually have an impact on the Jewish future in the mandate Palestine. And so to say, Poland was not important enough to play an important role in or any major role in this game. So even before the war, there was this understanding that you have to choose a strong ally to sort of adhere to. And after the White Book, Britain is their worst enemy. And even in their newspapers, 1940, 1941, we can find statements that Great Britain and Third Reich are equally to blame for the breakout of the war. It's literally said there. So, who's there? Like United States, who did not participate in the war until 1941, and then no third front in Europe. So then Soviet Union. I also think that it sort of responded not only to their political views, not only to their radically leftist and gradually more and more pro-Soviet views, but also to the psychological need to somehow overcome their both spiritual and physical isolation. These were young people who sort of wanted to be a part of this war that they felt was a war for their future, and they couldn't. So they had to, you know, support someone and hope that someone will sort of win. And USSR seemed to be definitely powerful enough to do so. And regarding the Polish eastern border, I have to say that this is really not an issue there, as if the fall of Poland in September of 1939 confirmed their conviction that Poland is not a major political player. But not only that, in Breslaw's writings, we see that he was also ready to sort of turn a blind eye to the persecution of the Zionist activists in the Soviet Union. And I think that here we reached like a very important point of like two lines running through the political transformation of Hashomer Hatzair during the war. Some kind of argument that Breslaw sort of won. And I was trying to represent it through like this accord between Breslaw and Kaplan, who was much more skeptical towards the Soviet Union. And I think it is very well reflected in the position that they took upon in the Congress in July of 1941, when they the outcome of the Congress was later published in the press, and it's extremely long, but you find there like really contradictory points. So in one place, they are condemning the persecution of the Zionist leaders and Zionist organizations in the Soviet Union, and say that this is unacceptable and we have to support them and so on. But in the other place, very close to the end, where, you know, everything resonates more strongly, they are deciding to adopt the International as their second anthem. This is really a very powerful move to make. And also, it is stated very clearly in the newspaper that making International second anthem of Hashomer Hatzair was the only point that was not accepted anonymously, that there were people against it. So you see that there is this line of this accord running through the movement, but still Breslaw sort of won it because he was just such a prolific writer. He just wrote tens, hundreds of editorials. He was the one who was so engaged that he sort of managed his line to be more visible than the other one. So just to address your question about exile, I think the moment when Breslaw is in Lithuania is actually a defining moment for him, because he goes there and he's writing to his brother that maybe I'll emigrate to Eretz Israel, as we know he was hoping before the war, and he was just waiting for the moment he can leave. And there he decides, no, I'm going to stay, I'm going to subordinate to the orders, and he's completely transforming his vision of himself, abandoning his previous hopes, and he decides that he wants to go back to Poland. Actually, it was interesting because he was disappointed that they only let him go in February. He wanted to go earlier, but he was stopped for some organizational reasons. So he became a person that he was later there in Lithuania, and and I think it's important because many other people left, including, for example, his close friend Josef Shamir, who disobeyed the order of the leaders from Eretz Israel, and he made Aliyah in 1941. He stayed in Vilnius up until then, and he made Aliyah. And Breslaw returned. He sort of always remained faithful to this decision of returning and engaging, and he traveled around and so on. And about the afterlife of this figure, I think because his influence was rather, I would say, intellectual than organizational, and he also was killed before the uprising. He didn't make it to the canon of the heroes of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, so I think his memory is a bit overshadowed. Also, he's a friend of Anielewicz. It's not good to have a famous friend because you sort of disappear from history. And also, I think that to capture Breslaw, it's crucial to look at Ringelblum archive, and only, I think, with the recent publication and edition in Polish, it became more clear how important he was, how important of a Onek Shabbos collaborator he was. Thank you.
So, czy ty masz pytanie, czy dodatkowy komentarz?
Bardzo przepraszam, mam takie wrażenie, że nie na wszystkie pytania odpowiedziałem. Myślałem, że po prostu po jednym pytaniu będziemy tutaj się wypowiadać. Także jeszcze parę słów, już krótko, na temat tego okresu, kiedy Borwicz był na uchodźstwie i kwestii życie po życiu. Więc jeśli chodzi o Borwicza, to tutaj taką widzę w jego biografii taką pewną ambiwalencję. Jeśli chodzi o życie prywatne, to rzeczywiście był na pewno bardzo osamotniony. Tam nie do końca jest wyjaśniona sytuacja jeszcze z okresu wojny, z jego prac literackich i wspomnień wynika, że stracił jakąś bardzo bliską osobę w okresie II wojny światowej. Przypuszczalnie albo to była narzeczona, albo żona, i on do końca życia nie zawarł związku małżeńskiego, nie miał też dzieci. Natomiast jeśli chodzi o takie życie zawodowe, to rzeczywiście miał bardzo, bardzo bogato. On się angażował niezwykle w działania Polonii w Paryżu i w ogóle we Francji. Uczestniczył w różnych inicjatywach dotyczących historii, literatury polskiej, żydowskiej. Występował w Radiu Wolna Europa. Przez 5 lat był dyrektorem sekcji jidysz w Radiu Francuskim. Założył, kierował przez wiele lat takie Centrum Badań Historii Żydów w Polsce. Wydawał mnóstwo artykułów, pisał też do kultury, do zeszytów historycznych, także też często można było go w Bibliotece Polskiej w Paryżu zobaczyć i usłyszeć. Był zaangażowany bardzo w wiele różnych spraw polskich, wychodził z różnymi inicjatywami natury politycznej, także tutaj na pewno można by wiele jeszcze na ten mówić. Natomiast jeśli chodzi o takie życie po życiu, to mam takie wrażenie, że jest to postać bardzo niedoceniona, że już dawno powinna się ukazać jego biografia. Teraz może ostatnio powstało wiele inicjatyw, jeśli chodzi o wznawianie jego prac i tłumaczenie jego prac, które ukazały się we Francji, choćby doktorat, który obronił na Sorbonie w 1953 roku. Więc no, i myślę, że no, kiedyś może powstanie jego pełna biografia i ten cały jego dorobek, dziedzictwo zostanie docenione, a na szczęście wiele się zachowało materiałów, które go dotyczą w różnych archiwach w Polsce i za granicą. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. We have some 15 minutes left, and I have Konstante Geppert and Jeff Schatz on the list.
Dziękuję bardzo. Oprócz tych wszystkich pytań już postawionych i odpowiedzi udzielonych, mam jeszcze małe pytanie do pana Trębacza. Czy Shmuel Zygielbojm w jakich okolicznościach pojawił się w Londynie? Czy był już wyposażony w pełnomocnictwo, jak chodzi o reprezentację partii w rządzie? Czy był jakimś takim bardziej ochotnikiem na własną rękę, który później te jakieś pełnomocnictwa zdobył?
Zygielbojm was appointed a member of the National Council by an appointment from the Polish government, and he was chosen by the Polish government as the representative of Bund. Bund didn't want Zygielbojm to be the representative of the party there in London. They wanted Ehrlich to be one, but Ehrlich was arrested and he could not get to London, and nobody knew when he will be able to. So the Bundist in New York made Zygielbojm to sign a document in which he stated that he will resign whenever Ehrlich will be able to come, and also in the document was stated that he won't act on his own, but he will always be in contact with the comrades in New York, and he will do whatever they all agree that he should be doing. At some point, he stopped doing this. He did, but it didn't make any sense for him at some point. They thought that he was intellectually not capable to be a member of the National Council. The second question. I wouldn't say that it is for Bundist, that this is a generation thing, because there was during the interwar history of the Bund, there is a constant clash between the two groups within the Bund, which one would be very keen to cooperate with Soviet Union, and the other is not. So the fact that Zygielbojm's comrades were arrested in the Soviet Union wasn't crucial for him. For him, the crucial thing was the actions of the communists in the interwar period in the 20s, when they tried to demolish Bund. They tried to divide it and create their own Kombund and get them into the Communist Party, and also the activities of the Communist Party in the 30s, when they said that Bundists were social fascists. So this was a thing that was unacceptable for Zygielbojm.
Okay, thank you a lot for this comments and questions. And yes, this is exactly as Konstante Geppert said. It's very hard to interpret this because it's deeply paradoxical process, and I think that Breslaw is a perfect case to illustrate it. Of course, it is a generational issue. As I've mentioned, Kaplan was the only senior member among the leadership of Hashomer Hatzair during the war. The rest of them were in their early 20s, and I believe that Breslaw was the youngest person among the leadership. He was only born in 1920. And I think that certainly this played some role in his radicalism, sort of breaking free and so on. But I think there is also something much more than this, because it's not just that it's something happening to somebody else somewhere else, although of course I think this threat is visible there, but there is also this hope that Soviet communism can be transformed. And he was not the only one to believe so, because he never stopped being Zionist. Never, ever. So he was just hoping that somehow Zionism can be incorporated or remain in accord with Soviet communism, and that, you know, a sort of future Palestine will be its own, the future country in Mandate Palestine will be its own state, but also in coalition or close collaboration with the Soviet Russia, also ideological, not just in terms of power. And yeah, and certainly he was a believer who was ready to suppress the knowledge about the persecution of Zionist parties, but also to suppress the disturbing news, for example, from the Eastern Front, because in the news bulletin that he was preparing based on radio monitoring, sometimes he forgot to mention that Soviets just lost in Crimea, for example, in the, you know, in one of the decisive battles. It just did not occur that it's worth writing. And for example, Abraham Levin commented later that he learned about it from the, you know, from the German megaphone on the Ghetto street. So there is something going on with this willingness, let them win somehow. And I think this issue of, you know, need for action is also a very important thing here. Britain may have been, you know, part of the Allied coalition, but so what? They, in the view of Hashomer Hatzair, they did nothing to, you know, to change the power dynamics in Europe. They just waited and waited, and this press is filled with these calls to create the third front. Like, where is the third front? So I think it's just a very complicated mixture of things here. Thank you.
So we have 2 minutes to go if I don't see anybody raising his... Stefan.
Tak, no właśnie, bo ja też nie odpowiedziałem na te ostatnie pytania i może chciałbym zabrać głos, bo troszkę mi się wydaje, że jeśli chodzi o Michała Borwicza, no, trochę sytuacja była inna, że tutaj bardziej go dotknęły znaki czasu. Jego postać mi się, jeśli chodzi o ten okres międzywojenny, to wydaje mi się, że on przede wszystkim nie był politykiem, tylko był po prostu literatem, pisarzem, poetą. I to ze względu może na jego charakter. On tam nawet w swoich wspomnieniach pisze, że był on mieszkał na ulicy Pawiej w Krakowie i tam w tej dzielnicy ponoć wszyscy go znali, bo był strasznym obuzem. Chodził tam na grandę, gdzieś tam jakieś kradł owoce, czy no po prostu bił się tam z kolegami i tak dalej. I wydaje mi się, że ten właśnie ten jego taki zadziorny charakter, to, że po prostu nie pozwolił sobie w kaszę dmuchać, jak to się dawniej mówiło, zmusiło go do radykalizacji jego poglądów i w ogóle do zaangażowania się w politykę. On przecież, ja o tym nie powiedziałem, bo oczywiście na to nie było czasu, on naprawdę bardzo się literacko udzielał w okresie międzywojennym. Pisał nie chcę powiedzieć dziesiątek różnych czasopism, ale tak to czasami, tak to właściwie wygląda, jak zaczynam czytać te jego prace. Interesował się teatrem, recenzował, pisał swoje opowiadania, napisał przecież powieść. I wydaje mi się, że on jakby został zmuszony do tego, żeby zareagować. Po prostu to był taki człowiek. To go zmusiło, żeby on przypomniał sobie, w cudzysłowie, że po pierwsze jest Żydem, a po drugie, że właśnie, no, żeby uznać, że który to ruch jest postępowy, który jest taki, który nie spowoduje upadku Rzeczypospolitej. I tu uznał, że to jest właśnie socjalizm, że to jest czas na socjalizm i tu jest jedyna droga, że to jest właśnie ruch postępowy, który spowoduje, że po pierwsze nie będzie podziału na Polaków, na dwa rodzaje gatunki Polaków, że tak powiem, Polacy i Polacy żydowskiego pochodzenia. I on jakby został właśnie przez te wypadki, przez te wydarzenia II wojny światowej, no jeszcze wcześniej ten okres nacjonalizmu, ten okres sanacji, który tak bardzo też dotknął społeczność żydowską w Polsce, po prostu zmuszony do pewnych działań i do pewnego zaangażowania się w tą działalność także i polityczną. Dziękuję.
So sorry for cutting you off. That was not my intention. So I think that's it for this panel. Thank you very much for attending and for the questions.